Good morning, or afternoon, depending upon where you are, and welcome to the Middle East Institute. I'm Dick Clarke, the Chairman of the Board of Governors of MEI, and we welcome you to MEI in its 75th year. We're celebrating throughout the year with a series of conferences, including this, our second annual conference on cybersecurity and the Middle East. We look forward to a whole series of fascinating discussions today and a great keynote. But first, a word about MEI and a word about our sponsors. The Middle East Institute is a nonpartisan institute in Washington, the purpose of which is to improve relations between and among the United States and the nations and people of the Middle East. Nonpartisan, objective, and it has three pillars. It has a think tank with independent scholars and publications online and in hard copy, holding conferences like this one. This is part of the think tank. It has a vibrant arts and culture program, including an art gallery in Washington dedicated to contemporary Middle East art. And it has an educational program, teaching thousands of people the languages and culture of the region. Today's conference is sponsored by Aramco, which is a generous sponsor of all of the cyber project at MEI. The cyber project is one of many projects in the think tank focusing on the current state of the Middle East and the future. Also, there's a program on climate change and the environment, as well as regional studies programs. Today's program, in particular, is also sponsored by, at the gold level, Microsoft, I think you know what they do, and Owl Security, which is in the IoT security business. Also at the silver sponsor level, Arista's Awake Security, which does network detection and response. BitSight, which does scoring of companies for their cybersecurity. And Trusono, which is in the world of passwordless access. At the bronze level, we have IBM Security to thank. I think you know them. Aon, the insurance company. Hawkeye 360, the maker of small satellites. Checkpoint, which of course is famous for firewalls and other things. And ReliaQuest, a managed security provider. Without them, this conference could not take place. And without our great speakers, it could not take place. The first of those speakers is my friend, my senator, and also the chairman, more importantly, the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Mark Warner. Before he was senator, he was the governor of Virginia. And before that, he was an entrepreneur in the world of cybersecurity and infrastructure. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the chairman of the SSCI, Mark Warner.
Hello, I'm Virginia Senator Mark Warner, and I'd like to thank my friend and MEI Chairman Richard Clarke for the opportunity to speak at this second annual cyber conference. This conference and the discussions that are going to be taking place during it are so critically important as people not only across America, but around the world realize the significance of cybersecurity. As Dick knows, I've had the opportunity to serve on the Intelligence Committee for a number of years, most recently as vice chairman, and then with the switch in control as chairman of the committee. We have taken this issue of cybersecurity on, full on, head on. I'm happy to say this is one of the few remaining areas where there is complete bipartisan agreement in Congress that something needs to be done. We also know that this is a problem that simply spending more money alone, while more money is needed, oftentimes will not be the answer. Some of the cybersecurity issues go back to design flaws in the software writing, and sometimes large-scale companies that don't do enough to protect their own software and tools. We've also seen in the last number of months how vulnerable we are. I think about the SolarWinds hack initiated by Russia that broke into a trusted supply chain, and in the SolarWinds hack got into 18,000 companies. We also saw an attack done by China called the Microsoft Hafnium attack, while not receiving as much attention, also into literally thousands of enterprises. More recently, we've seen much higher profile ransomware attacks. Colonial Pipeline, where literally a third of the country's gasoline stations were shut down for close to a week. Or more recent attacks against meat packagers, ferries, Hill committees, government agencies, that I think have brought this issue home to Americans that this is something we can no longer ignore. What keeps me up at night is the combination of these two. If an adversary had decided, for example, in a supply chain attack, like SolarWinds, not simply to go into certain companies and exfiltrate out information, but literally go in and create a denial service attack across all those 18,000 penetrated companies, we could have seen a complete breakdown in our economy. And I know this audience realizes that's not just hypothetical. That's what Russia did in Ukraine a number of years back. Or while we've seen the ransomware attacks against critical infrastructure in this country, it could even be worse, as we've seen more recently where literally the whole Irish healthcare system was shut down. So what do? Well, one, we do need to improve our defenses. That means we need to make sure that there are cybersecurity standards. The NIST standards are a step in the right direction, but we need to make sure that we reinforce good practices. Part of this may also be around the development of a cybersecurity insurance products that may be able to drive best practices as well, rather than simply through government regulation. We also need to acknowledge that cyber defense alone may not be enough. Too often, I think we've found when we look at tier one adversaries, Russia and China in particular, when they bring their A team to the table, their chances of being successful, at least getting in, are unfortunately pretty high. So how do we not only do as much as possible to protect, but then make sure if the bad guys get in, we can limit the damage and also make sure people are realizing the attacks in real time. We also need to acknowledge that this is a challenge not only from nation states like Russia and China, but increasingly other adversaries like Iran and North Korea. And as we've seen with the recent ransomware attacks, in many places there are individuals that, while maybe not directly connected to the government, are cyber criminals, and in many of these countries, unfortunately, particularly in Russia, continue to operate with at least the tacit approval of their government. So the time is now. So what do we do to start with? And I would love to have feedback on these three short-term suggestions. Number one, and we will shortly announce bipartisan legislation that will require mandatory incident reporting towards those entities that are critical infrastructure, the federal government, or federal government contractors. In the case of SolarWinds or the case of Colonial, neither one of those entities had to report. We need to make sure that there is a requirement to report real time, and particularly for private sector companies, we would give them some level of limited immunity and confidentiality, so there is not this hesitancy to report. And our hope is, by having this incident reporting to the government, that will then be shared with private sector partners, both on the cyber defense side and the cloud providers like Microsoft and Amazon. Even though maybe one company penetrated, we may be able to get mid-incident to those other enterprises that may not have yet been penetrated. So incident reporting with appropriate protections for private sector companies to this public-private entity, somewhat similar to the National Transportation Safety Board. Second is, we need to realize that this is not an American-only problem. We need to put in place international norms where we send a clear signal that if a company or a country, for example, may be harboring cyber criminals, if they are attacking a critical infrastructure or a healthcare system, as the case of Ireland, those kind of activities will not be sanctioned. We will respond on a offensive basis, and we will respond not just from America, but from countries around the world. We've seen these kind of international regimes around other weapon systems. I think we need it as well in cyber. And then finally, we need to open an honest debate about the ability of private sector entities to pay ransomware. I'm not ready to come out with a position yet about that ability, because there are certain real-world examples where the catastrophic consequences may be so great that an enterprise may need an exemption. We ought to at least start that debate, though. But what we can do in the interim is make sure that there is more transparency around these payments. We've seen most recently with the Justice Department going after the bad guys in the case of Colonial Pipeline. There are ways for us to strike back, but we need that transparency in terms of these payment systems. I do look forward to hearing the ideas that come out of this conference. This is an area that is obviously evolving on a regular basis. And I want to, again, thank my good friend Dick Clarke for, one, his friendship, for his willingness to teach me about this domain, and very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to this second annual